Yes, thank you very much. The organizers of Pages Human Traces Workshop. Good morning. As John has said it, I'm Rahab Kinyanjui, working at the National Museums of Kenya. And this morning I'm going to present some work I've been working with my colleagues listed there in East Turkana that goes back to Holocene period, trying to understand the interaction of humans and the environment in the eastern side of Turkana. It's an arid region, and most of the community there, they're nomadic pastoralism, which goes back to 4,000 years, the first evidence that we have for domestication of animals. I'm going to present this paper in two categories. One is looking in the past, in the Holocene. How did the humans interacted with the environment? How was the environment? And Holocene in particular was it's very critical because of the climatic variability that happened, especially in African region, in East Africa, and this region in particular. The relationship of humans and environments in East Africa, it is recorded, it goes back to a long time in terms of history, because it goes back to prehistoric times, and evolution of humans and mammals is all intertwined with the environment that they lived in. And we see that they started being bipedal because of the trying to respond to the environmental changes, where forests were becoming more shrink and grasslands were becoming more prominent. And so those are the triggers of the human evolution. And also the technological their behavior and their technological affiliation is also connected or interconnected with the major climatic events in this region. But we'll focus on the dynamics during the Holocene period, back 10,000 years, and specifically between the nomadic pastoralists, because at least we have evidence that they've been here since 4,000 years, and this is the longest economic activity that has been recorded so far. We know even domestication of plants in the late Holocene also happened as one of the adaptation responses to the shifting mid-late Holocene climates that were increasingly getting arid. So this the map here is showing the study site, the eastern side of Lake Turkana, and we have two major sites where we have these Holocene deposits. They called Galana Boy, the northern part, the Ileret Ridge, and we have Kobifora Ridge. And the major climatic events that we are already recorded, that we have evidence, include African humid period, which happened in the early Holocene. And this time is characterized by wet and humid climatic situation, when the archaeological record that we have from this time period is the evidence of fishing, because we have bone harpoons that were preserved in these sediments to show that these guys were actually fishermen, and they were hunters and gatherers. Then come to, and also because it was we had high lake stand that was approximately 80 meters above what is the current level. Then during the mid-Holocene, the lakes dropped to 55 meters. It was still higher than what we have today, but this again was in response to dry climate that was happening. And that's around the time, mid-Holocene, the time that we see pastoralism kicking in. And the Dagodian site is an example of this evidence for domestication of animals. And then late Holocene, climate became more drier and humans adapted to nomadic pastoralism. And this activity has persisted over the time until present time. So our approach here, we're looking at paleobotanical and archaeological evidence. And for paleobotanical, we analyze phytolith data, because being an environment that's fully covered with vegetation structure that has dominance of grasses, And with the pollen, it's not easy to identify different grasses, the tall grasses, the short grasses that are affiliated with different climatic regimes. So phytoliths come in handy as a nice proxy to be able to differentiate the grass dynamics. And then the material culture, although in archaeological record, very few, and I'll explain why when we get to the modern aspect of it. The material culture in these sites are very few, but 1, 2, 3 specimens showing a particular kind of economic subsistence, it's something that is to wow about. So phytolith data, for those who are not familiar with phytoliths, these are silica bodies that are formed in plant cells. They form either in or around cells, and once the plant decomposes, these silica casts are left in the soils, and they can be able to tell can be able to identify the sources of these silicified cells from the plant. And we know physiologically, anatomically, monocots and dicots, they have different structural cellular structures. So we can be able to identify these between plants, different plants, to reconstruct vegetation composition and structure. They are particularly important because some key taxonomic and ecological significant plant species or community can be identified. Plants like palms are very important in the archaeological record, paleoecological record, because they give signal of high water table or wetlands or swampy wetlands. Then we have C4 panicoid grasses in the case, especially for the arid region, where they are more affiliated to humid and more wet season, while C4 grasses are particular signals of arid situations. Then we can separate woody taxons versus grasses, so we can be able to tell how was the canopy. Was it very closed vegetation structure, or was it open grasslands? Then sages, they are also specific morph types of phytoliths. So once you get them in your assemblage, you can be able to tell whether you had some wetlands or some swampy environments, habitats within your environments. We sampled, we did our sampling from the Holocene sites, most of them which were studied before, either with archaeological evidence or geological evidence. And so they had well-dated Holocene sediments, and we could tell these are coming from early Holocene, mid-Holocene, or late Holocene. And as usual, the lab and be able to identify the grasses, how the grasses are, then the woody taxa, then we have things like palms down here and sages. So they are very good to be able to identify such key species. And this is again plotted using TILIA diagram to be able to see how the dynamics of the assemblage is happening and the abundance across time, and to see where these changes are. And for instance, when you look at the early Holocene, we have panicoid grasses, we have signal of palms happening, we have sages during early Holocene, but when you look at the rest of the profile, they are missing out in the profile. But wooded vegetation, which is not surprising, especially for some arid region, because of the shrubs and scrubs, they are more resilient on the landscape. They are more consistent on the landscape. To bring a bigger picture, we see the wooded vegetation is more prominent, but in early Holocene, we see the wetlands elements are consistently present, which is telling you about the humidity and the precipitation aspect of during the early Holocene when the lakes were up. We had a high lake stand. Then transition of when we go to the transition between early to mid Holocene, we see the sages are absent. We see palms are absent in this scenario, and also we don't have a lot of spotted spicules. So this is, and the woody taxa are also going down, showing us a bit, not much, but there's a significant change in the assemblage. Then on to bring the bigger picture. Again, on this, we see the wetlands elements are becoming quite rare or uncommon, but woodlands are still quite significant. Then during the mid and late Holocene, this is now when it's more increasing dry, and this is where now the lake level is up to 55 meters, unlike the early Holocene lake level, which was a little bit higher. And we see in this level that corridor grasses have the highest peak, showing the drying situation during this period. You can see also that the wetland elements are also quite rare. The modern samples that we have processed for phytoliths to be able to see whether phytolith data will reflect the above ground vegetation cover. And we collected 4 samples from different vegetation habitats. Sample 1 was collected from a wooded vegetation environment, but with some seasonal streams. Then sample 2 was recovered from more inland, where we just have more wooded vegetation. Sample 3 was collected from a riparian environment, and sample 4 was collected from a vegetation cover that was dominated with grasses. And we could see the thread with the phytoliths is reflecting the kind of the vegetation above ground that is in the local vegetation of the sample. The lessons from the past. Phytolith data show Holocene vegetation cover has changed in response to climate variability, and the existing archaeological evidence indicate that humans responded to these changes by shifting their subsistence acquisition. During early Holocene, when the climates were warm and humid, lake levels were high, wooded vegetation cover, they relied on fishing, hunting, and gathering. During the mid-Holocene, climates were increasing drier, lake levels dropped, and vegetation cover was dominated with open grasslands. They shifted to nomadic pastoralism, where they moved with their livestock depending on season for greener pastures and water availability, the longest economic activity in the region. So those were the lessons from the past and what we know in the archaeological and paleobotanical record. But today we also do work in progress, but learning from today's present day human environment interaction with my colleagues. And mainly we are working with the pastoralists in East Turkana Basin. And our methods, we are mapping the land use patterns using livestock. We tag the grazers versus browsers. We want to find, are their migration corridors similar or different? If yes, how do they differ? As in, how do they take through the grazers, because grazers are searching for grasses, and browsers, they are mainly they can really survive even in the bushes. So I'm going to give an example of one of the grazer that we already tagged in the month of November last year to February this year. And you can see the range, the grazing range, where the animal has been moving all around the landscape. And even you can tell where they have spent most of the time during that period. And what is more interesting is that this GPS collar are also recording the temperatures. So we are also recording getting the average temperatures for the days and for the nights in this region. And this is also a good aspect to understand the dehydration aspect of the humans and the livestock and all that. And again, we can be able to tell how they are using this landscape, where they are grazing for a longer time, or where they are just passing corridors. The dots in red are showing areas where they have spent most time grazing while the dots in pink, they spent few days, but the one in white just showing it was maybe a night over, and they continued migrating to the pastures they were planning to go to. So what can we learn adaptation strategies that are taken by the pastoralists in this region? Season-dependent nomadism. The community have policies, and I put in quotes because these are very informal, on how and when they use pastures and water resources during the rainy season and during the dry season. You realize most of the time when during the rainy season, they would want to use the landscape that has very sparse vegetation cover to take advantage of the very initial sprouts of grasses and herbs, and spare the bushes and those areas where it's more vegetated for the drought season. Then the way they reoccupy the abandoned bomas, it is carefully selected not to occupy the exact location because they want to go fertilizing the land, because these kilns or the bomas, they have the manure from the livestock, which is fertilizing the ground and making that ground and the soils more nutrients rich in nutrients. And so there are more herbs and grasses that grow very fast when the rains come in. So in the process, they are fertilizing the land and increasing more such hotspots for their tomorrow grazing. The more bomas they have, the more land is fertilized, creating more hotspots. And also the sharing aspect of how they share between resources such as water. When they borrow or loan each other, it is very categorical and very well managed. Then scarce material world ownership, which makes the movement and settlement easier and efficient. And also this aspect tells us in archaeological record, that's why you miss the material culture, because they have very little. So very little is wasted for future reference, for archaeological like preservation. And that's why one item or two items will give a bigger picture of what was happening on the landscape during the archaeological time, the Holocene. Again, selective use and recycling of building materials, long-term ownership of the little furniture they own, all these are, it's a way of conservation, or a way of minimizing the cutting of trees, because most of their furniture, most of the tools they have, most of the containers they have, they are all plant resources. Yes, and I would like to acknowledge the institutions that have supported this work, starting with National Museums of Kenya, NACOSTI for the permits. We have KEMRI, who are looking at the water quality and the hydration aspect and the medical aspect of the health aspect of the community. Then University of George Washington, DC, who are in partnership with National Museums of Kenya. And then a Kobifora Research and Training Program that runs annually, except for the few years since the pandemic. And of course, I would like to acknowledge and be thankful to the First Pages Human Traces Workshop organizers for giving the opportunity to present this work, irrespective of the challenges. The funding sources is National Museums of Kenya in kind. Then we have NSF grant that has supported this work. Thank you very much for listening.